You are listening to the Two and Out CFL podcast, a proud member of the Canadian Football Podcast Network.
Grab some poutine and a double-double. It's time for the Two and Out CFL podcast.
He's got it! Oh, baby!
Every week, Travis Currah.
That's Grey Cup me, which is a different person.
And Brazilian Tide.
Hunters are people too.
Talk fantasy football, bring you the latest in CFL news, and sprinkle in a little bit of nonsense.
Oh, nearly intercepted it is! And it's over!
Ready, set, hunt!
And joining the show this week is senior journalist and team historian of the Saskatchewan Roughriders, Rob Vanstone. Thank you so much for coming on the show to talk Rough Rider history.
Oh, pleasure. It's one of my favorite topics, if not my favorite topic. So it's well, actually, my that and my dog. So
tell us about your dog
session before too long. So.
Well, what's her name?
Candy. She's a 3-year-old rescue, and I absolutely adore her. So
I love that. Now it's 10 years since the 2013 Grey Cup, so I thought it would be great to sort of do a chat about 2013 and everything that went into that special year. But something happened at the beginning of October in the world of the Saskatchewan Roughriders, Canada, Regina, Canadian football. We ended up losing a legend, George Reed. And that 2013 Grey Cup, I guess, was hosted at the house George built or Ronnie built, or whichever way you want to put it. Can you, I guess, personally, do you have any memories of, I don't want to age you, but number 34 on the field, or your first memories of George?
My first memories are of being in elementary school, kindergarten, grade 1 at Massey School in Regina, late 60s, early 70s. And everybody was big on trading football cards back then. And it was like a gold bar to get a George or a Ronnie card. That was a status symbol on the playgrounds of Massey School. And I ended up with like neither for the longest time. I remember bribing classmates with chocolate bars. I remember saying, I'll go to Larry's Confectionery at lunchtime and I'll buy you like 3 bar sixes if I can have your Ronnie, if I can have your George. No, so I ended up going to Larry's and just kept buying football cards and buying football. And it was unbelievable. Like I think I would have had a better luck today getting a $28 million lottery ticket than I would have been getting a Ronnie or a George back then. And so I finally got them and I put them on my little bulletin board at home and punched holes in each corner to ensure that they have no lasting value, but there's a sentimental value there. So that was the introduction to it right off the bat. It was just this is big. You got a Ronnie, you got a George. And first, I'd seen him play before this, but August of 1972, I was 8 years old, and I was a really bad goaltender. So I went to the Hickey Brothers Hockey School in Regina at the Kinsman Arena, and I was such a great goaltender that they had me practice with the forwards. And but I remember walking into the lobby of the Kinsman Arena with my goaltending equipment, which I assure you was unmarked by pucks, and George Reed was sitting in the office at the arena. And it was just like, oh my goodness. As many times as I'd seen him on the field and as many times as I'd walked by his kids in the halls of Massey School, there was George Reed. And I just froze. And I remember my mom just kind of politely or even impolitely nudging me, go into the office, go say hi to him. And I just remember being about 5 feet away and he saw me approaching and just, hey buddy. And I just felt like $1 million. And, that was my first, one-on-one encounter with George. And I don't like being old, but I like the fact that I'm old enough to remember having seen Ronnie and George play. There's a lot of days I wish I was a little older so I could say I saw Hugh Campbell. But it was just Ronnie and George and Ronnie. That was my childhood growing up. And I feel like I've been reliving parts of it this past week or so because all that stuff just keeps coming back.
I was 13 months old when the 89 Grey Cup happened. So when I hear tales of Ronnie and George, they're almost like comic book superheroes to me, but it was almost like they were comic book superheroes for kids and Rider fans and football fans that got to watch them play in the flesh as well. And it's an era of Canadian football. Recently, we lost Angelo Mosca, and now somebody like George Reed. These are names that are going to live in Canadian football history for forever. Can you talk about the man he was off the field as well?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, as impressive as he was on the field, and 16,116 yards and 134 rushing touchdowns, 137 in total, 11 1,000-yard seasons in 13 years in the Canadian Football League, etc. I mean, the resume, I could pretty much read his playing resume and exhaust the time that remains on the podcast. But so many of the honors that came his way really didn't have anything to do with football. He was able to use football as a platform to, I think, bolster his community work. But it was the community work that, he spent more years doing community work than he did playing football.
Yeah.
He spent 13 years playing football, and he did community work pretty much from the time he got to Regina in 1963. This is someone who at one time was involved with 47 different charitable or community groups at one time. I referenced Massey School earlier. He was the president of the Massey School Home and School Association. Things as, a low profile as that, all the way up to helping to bring Special Olympics to Saskatchewan. It just ran the gamut. He was absolutely inexhaustible, and received the Order of Canada in 1978, and that was largely on the strength of what he did in the community as a citizen. Just a remarkable man with an unbelievable capacity to help people. And he wore number 34, and I'm pretty sure there were 34 hours in his day. I don't know how else he managed to do it. It was just remarkable, and he was that way well into his 70s, early 80s. I remember one year I used to do a sports memorabilia sale when I was working at the Regina Leader Post, and we would sell sports memorabilia that we asked readers to donate, and it was for charity. And I remember once I called George Reed not long after he moved back to Regina early in 2009 and asked him to come out and sign autographs. And I said, would you be willing to come out and sign autographs for an hour? And he goes, no. And there's kind of silence on the end of the line. And I'm wondering, okay, like, how do I, gracefully say goodbye? And then I hear that deep belly laugh, and he goes, no, I'll do 2 hours. And
wow.
And then he ended up sticking around for 2.5. And as soon as he walked into the room, without drawing any attention to himself, simply by walking into the room, everybody stood up and applauded, gave him a standing ovation. I'm not sure I'll ever encounter anybody in this community, or perhaps anywhere that I'm in proximity to, that can elicit a standing ovation simply by walking into a room as unobtrusively as possible. He didn't court the attention, wasn't particularly comfortable with it, but nonetheless, that was the response everywhere he went. And I think it's amazing what he did on the field, but off the field, that just on top of what he did on the field, well, I don't think we'll ever see his like again.
That's so wild that you mentioned that. Last November at the Grey Cup in Regina, I got to shake George's hand, and it was at the Legends Luncheon at the Grey Cup. And I mean, former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper is there. There's a lot of people that have done really cool things for Canada and football in general. And when George gets pointed out, you can't describe it. It's like everybody is just moved to give the man a standing ovation. And my dad got to watch him play. My dad got to meet him. That's kind of guy my dad is. When when everybody got in line for autographs and got the picture of George Reed, he said, "Well, sign that out to my son Travis." Well, I'm like,
Oh,
and he met Gordie Howe, and he did the same thing as well to Gordie Howe. I never got to watch these guys play, but I do have autographs written out to me because of my dad. So
that's
those
wonderful.
special things to me, and I've relived highlights of George playing and recently over the past couple of weeks, and it strikes me just how much the game has changed, and the amount of obviously running. Well, he was a fullback,
Yeah.
technically on
The
the depth
fullback's
chart.
basically a blocker now, and every now and then they'll run a flare pattern. We're just going to flare out of the backfield. The fullback very rarely catches the ball if he is indeed on the field. And that's just football in general.
Yeah, and it was also he scores that touchdown in the 1966 Grey Cup, and and now if that happens, you can imagine the celebration, the dancing, all of that. But back then, nope. Grass
No,
stains.
he was never one for that. And watch the Hugh Campbell touchdown from that game. On the first play of the fourth quarter, Ronnie hits Huey for a 5-yard touchdown. And players are running toward Huey to shake his hand. I think he ran faster trying to get off the field than he did getting open in the end zone. He just wanted no acknowledgement on the field. He didn't want to rub it in at all.
Wow.
His head's down, and he is just making a beeline for the sideline because he just wants nothing to do with the celebration. Even a handshake was extended reluctantly. That was the mindset back then, and George was certainly that way. I mean, he had enough practice scoring touchdowns. I don't think he needed to do some of the things they do these days. You know, I mean, now they're celebrating first downs. Honestly.
Yep. Now it's funny, and maybe it's because it's a Saskatchewan Roughrider thing with 4 Grey Cups and over 1 century. But the Ronnie and George days, they had triumph in 1966, but they also had heartbreak, and that is synonymous with Saskatchewan Roughrider history. And it's almost looked at as the heyday of the team, the glory days of the team, but there's only one championship to speak for. Who was the big nemesis in that era that prevented them from
Probably
having
Calgary?
Yeah.
Calgary stood in the way a lot of years.
Yeah, they have.
1968, 1970, the Riders were 14-2 that year, and they played Calgary in a best-of-3 West final. And the third game was probably the coldest game in the history of perhaps football anywhere. And, they didn't even play the national anthem. It's on YouTube, and you get frostbite just by watching it on YouTube. And a 14-2 team, but Ronnie had been injured in game 2 and only played a couple of plays in game 3. Gary Lane ended up starting for a quarterback for the Roughriders in that game. And, you know, that's one of the great unknowables. What if Ronnie had been able to play in the 1970 West Final? I mean, he was the most outstanding player in the league that year. 1971, the Riders played Calgary in the playoffs. Those George Reed, Wayne Harris, epic battles. And sometimes whoever came out of that really didn't have much left when it came time to go to the Grey Cup, because back then the East played 14 regular season games, whereas the West played 16. And then sometimes you'd play 5 Western playoff games to even get to the Grey Cup. It was a smaller playoff schedule in the East too. So sometimes those West teams were really in a disadvantageous situation going down East to play in the Grey Cup. The Riders were banged up in 1967. They got to the Grey Cup and they played Hamilton and lost. 1968, a very good Calgary team lost to Ottawa. 1969, the Roughriders had some injuries, went and lost 29-11 to Ottawa in the Grey Cup. We've referenced 1970. It was really weighted I think, in favor of the East, the way the format was at that time. And there were some years when the Riders did encounter a lot of injuries before they could even get to the Grey Cup. And 1970, Montreal team, I think there was 7-6-1, beat a 9-7 Calgary team in the Grey Cup, and the 14-2 Roughriders weren't able to get there. And again, a lot of that is Ronnie being hurt.
Yeah. Now, I feel like some of that heartbreak and all of it kind of does add up to what happened in 2013. It was the last Grey Cup to be hosted at Taylor Field, and the Riders, it was their third Grey Cup appearance since 2009, and I do feel like all of this just adds into what a moment 2013 was. Obviously there was a lot of pressure on the team to go in hosting the game. Was there a moment that you can remember where Brendan Tommen, the general manager at the time, you said, well, these guys are going all in with the moves that they are making heading into the 2013 season?
I mean, they started in 2012. I mean, free agency was huge for them that year because they, on the first day of free agency, it was a bit of a controversial decision because Andy Fantuz signed with Hamilton, and but they needed to free up some money so that they could sign Brendan Labatt and Dominic Picard, which they did on day one. So suddenly you've got your foundational center, and you've got offensive guard who in the 2013 season would be named the league's outstanding offensive lineman. That same year, they obtained Xavier Fulton, their left offensive tackle from Edmonton, for a low-round draft pick, and they selected Ben Heenan first overall in the CFL draft. So suddenly there was only one holdover among the starting offensive linemen from 2011, and that was Chris Best.
Wow.
So a lot of that building took place in 2012. That's when Corey Sheets arrived. That's when Taj Smith arrived, and Taj caught 78 passes for the Grey Cup champions in 2013. So a lot of that work was done in 2012. And then 2013, Dwight Anderson is signed, and Ricky Foley comes on board, and John Chick is signed shortly before training camp. But that was 2 years in the making, and so many of the huge foundational pieces entered the equation in 2012. It's a little tougher to do now with the 1-year contracts. The 1-year contracts came into effect nearly a decade ago, whereas that was something the Riders had to their advantage in 2012. Is that there wasn't a 1-year contract. It pretty much had to be one in an option. So that today it's a little tougher to build for next year, because I don't know what percentage of the contracts are 1-year contracts now, but it's a pretty high percentage. And that came up, I think, that was introduced in the CBA of 2014. But that job Brendan Tommen did in 2012, leading into 2013, was absolutely masterful.
Now, pesky Calgary, they're back in 2013, and this whole era of Stampeders and Rough Rider football, the height of their rivalry was happening a decade ago, and the Riders started the season 5-0, and those pesky Rough Riders, after the Riders bye in week 6, or the Stampeders ended up beating the Riders. But then it's not like a championship team that didn't have adversity. That 4-game losing streak in the middle of September 2013, I think there were probably a lot of nervous fans in Saskatchewan and supporters of the Rough Riders at that time.
Yeah, I remember my inbox. There were a lot of nervous fans. And but that losing streak coincides precisely with the absence of Corey Sheets with a knee injury. And Corey Sheets returned for an October 14th game against the BC Lions. Riders went into Vancouver and won 31-17 and lost only one game of consequence the remainder of the year. That being a loss in Calgary. I think it was the penultimate game of the season. But even then, I think the Riders were confident that they had another crack at Calgary, that they would win. And as it turned out, the toughest challenge the Riders faced in the playoffs that year was the first playoff game at home against BC. BC was leading by 9 points after 3 quarters, and then Darian Durant pretty much took the game into his hands using his feet. And after that, it was 35-13 over Calgary and 45-23 over Hamilton. But that hurdle, getting past the BC Lions, was tough. But once Corey Sheets came back, that changed a lot of things. And George Cortez, the offensive coordinator that year, was absolutely a genius with what he could do. And I mean, that team had so much depth at receiver that G. Roy Simon was number 5. Like,
Wow.
I mean, honestly, Gressler, Getzlaff, Bagg, Taj Smith, G. Roy Simon. It's G. Roy Simon was number 5 on that in that hierarchy.
Now,
But then he was a number 1 target in the first half of the Grey Cup in 2013.
yeah.
But the opposing teams had to pay so much attention to stopping Corey Sheets and stopping the run that it created so many play action opportunities and pretty much one-on-one opportunities downfield with the passing game. And who do you double team when you've got 3 1,000-yard receivers on that team? Rob Bagg, who was very good, and G. Roy Simon, who was G. Roy Simon. Like, what on earth are you going to do if you're a defensive coordinator except maybe resign?
I guess we got to talk about Corey Sheets here. He only had 2 seasons in green and white, and I still see Sheets jerseys at Mosaic Stadium. He had almost 2,900 yards through 31 games. That's all he played in the regular season for the Roughriders. It's remarkable to think about the impact he's had just by playing 2 years in Regina.
Yeah, and he left after the 2013 season to sign with Oakland and had pretty much made the Oakland Raiders, and then was injured in their preseason finale, and never played football again. So, I mean, his last game of professional football that counted was a 197-yard rushing game in the Grey Cup in Toronto against Hamilton. Nice way to go out. That was a Grey Cup record for rushing yardage that endures. And I've never, it's interesting to see we'll always wonder what would have happened if Corey hadn't been injured that year, because he got 1,598 yards rushing, and he sat out the regular season finale just to rest, and then he missed some other games with a knee injury, and he was going to take a run at 2,000 yards if he hadn't gotten hurt. And even if you add his postseason totals, he had 1,598 yards. He had 68 against BC in the West semifinal, 177 in Calgary in the West final, and then 197 in the Grey Cup. I think it worked out to 2,040 yards rushing over the course of 18 games for which he dressed, and just an amazing year.
6.8 yards a carry in the playoffs alone.
Oh, and the play that pretty much put the Grey Cup away, they were 2nd and 19, and they handed off to Corey Sheets. And I remember he told me not long ago when I was talking to him, the call came in from the sidelines. They're expecting some kind of ingenuity with the passing game, and the call was draw play. And they're all going, what? And then on 2nd and 19, Corey Sheets ran for 21 yards. A block from Taj Smith right at the end turned that from a 17-yard run into a 21-yard run, and that allowed them to exhaust more time. That possession culminated in a Chris Milo field goal, and that was kind of the breathing room the Riders needed. Hamilton had closed to within 31-15 and 31-16, pardon me, and that was getting a little worrisome. And the Riders were up 31-6 at halftime, and then suddenly Hamilton's got more than a quarter left, and the score is uncomfortably close. And that Corey Sheets run on 2nd and 19, unbelievable. That was such a massive play in that game. It's not the most improbable run I've ever seen. I'm a Denver Bronco fan, and one year the Broncos were playing Minnesota, and it was 3rd and 37, and Minnesota handed off to Leroy Horde, and he went for 53 on 3rd and 37. They got a first down and a handoff. But
wow,
we're talking Grey Cup, 2nd and 19, and Corey Sheets does what Corey Sheets does.
Now, the 2013 playoffs, that West semifinal in Regina, I remember it well. I was living in Saskatoon. I remember I had these hand warmers that I also tried to put in my shoes, and they were the Celebration in Rider Nation Grey Cup merch, and they had this little metal piece that you would crack, and then the thing would harden and give you heat. Well, it broke and the thing didn't heat and it didn't harden. So I had one good foot and one frozen foot that I
That's why
think
they call it football and not feetball.
yeah. I think maybe I could feel my foot by about Dundurn on the way back to Saskatoon that night. But I remember what blew me away was Darian Durant, obviously, and the guy's not wearing sleeves in the game. It was probably the coldest game I'd ever personally been to. But Durant took over in the third quarter or the fourth quarter, a man on a mission. And you knew he wanted that, and he took over. He was better when it was cold, I thought.
Yeah, Darian, sometimes the best games he had weren't the ones where the stats were
Right.
unconscious. I mean, Darian was a great situational quarterback, and he was one of those athletes who can. It's an overused cliche, but he can will his team to victory. And football's been described as the ultimate team sport, and I would tend to subscribe to that argument. I mean, 11 of the 12 guys on a play can execute their assignments perfectly, but if one of the 12 blows an assignment, the play might be a disaster. I mean, there's so much that has to happen, and so much precludes one person being able to dominate compared to, say, the National Basketball Association or something. But to the extent that one person can take over a football game when there's 24 people on the field at a time, I think Darian Durant did that in that West semifinal that year. Just a formidable performance, a gutsy performance, one of those ones that I think is one of the most iconic individual performances in Rider history. And it was a playoff game in 1967. George Reed rushed for 204 yards on 37 carries. It was the first time anybody had rushed for 200 yards in a playoff game. And George was, banged up and hurt, but he pretty much controlled that entire game. The whole playbook was given to George. The whole playbook in the fourth quarter against BC wasn't Darian runs the ball, but those were the plays that tipped it. BC had really done a good job against Corey Sheets. He only rushed for 68 yards that game. And they were kind of bottled up, and the Riders were having trouble containing Travis Lulay that day. Mm-hmm. And but fourth quarter, Darian took over. He also threw a touchdown pass to Weston Dressler, a play that's kind of forgotten because people remember the Darian runs, but he also made things happen with his arm. Chris Milo kicked a clutch 45-yard field goal, and kicking that ball was like kicking a brick that day. and the defense didn't allow anything in the fourth quarter. After Travis Lulay was really keeping the Rough Riders off balance. So a lot of things had to happen in that fourth quarter, but after the game, it's one of those things. I admired it and I wanted to cry because I wish I'd thought of it. But somebody tweeted "legendarian," and I thought, "Oh man, that's good." Why didn't I think of that? I'm the one who's supposed to have some facility with the English language, but that just said it all. That one word tweet, "legendarian," and that's what that became. And that was the toughest challenge they faced. I mean, it was 22-6 at halftime in Calgary the next week, and it would have been worse for the Stampeders, except the Riders had fumbled on the 1 yard line late in the half. It should have been 29-6.
And that was it another cold one? I remember, and that game, you knew, I felt like I knew, and everybody knew, if the Riders won the West Final, it was going to be almost impossible to defeat them at home in the 101st Grey Cup. And the Riders went to McMahon Stadium and lost in the 2012 West semifinal. Another playoff game I remember driving from Lloydminster to in terrible roads. And I think it was Drew Tate hitting Romby Bryant for like an 80-yard touchdown late in the game that put the Stampeders ahead. So the 2013 West Final, it felt like it was almost a rematch of sorts from a year ago.
And that game really, resonated with a lot of the Rider players. And I think it was a real transformative, not necessarily a transformative game, but a game that put a lot of the criticism about Darian Durant to rest. And he threw 4 touchdown passes in that game, threw for 435 yards. threw the late touchdown pass to Greg Carr with, I think, 52 seconds remaining in the fourth quarter. And then came the long pass to Robbie Bryant down the right sideline. And, Chris Best was telling me that, he was, that one really did not sit well with him. And that, they were just kind of, a lot of the players would, I think they started their workout regimens a lot more quickly that off season than they normally would, because they just wanted to make amends for that. And because that one really stung. And if you look at it through history, the Roughriders have generally had that kind of game the year before they won a Grey Cup. In 1965, they lost 15-9 to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the West semifinal. And shades of the 2019 West final, when Cody Fajardo hit the crossbar, Ron Lancaster had Jim Warden open in the end zone at Winnipeg Stadium, and the ball hit the upright late in the game. Riders lost 15-9. 1989, Riders won a Grey Cup. Well, the year before, the Riders had made the playoffs for the first time in 11 years, and then BC came in here. Tony Cherry ran wild, and that one, I think, showed the Riders what level you have to be at. And a lot of those players from the 88 team carried over into 89. They remember that heartbreaker in 88. In 2006, the Riders got to the West Final in Vancouver, and that one really did not sit well with the players. And I know Gary Joseph told me many times, like, the players were saying, this is not going to happen to us again. And then you look 2012 going into 2013. So there's been that kind of knocking on the door and that unfinished business each year preceding a Rough Rider Grey Cup victory.
Now, I felt like Darian was feeling the pressure. Did 2013 almost feel like a last chance for him in that respect?
I think, he'd faced so much criticism, and he'd knocked on the door a couple of times, and the fans were starting to get, not all of them, I wouldn't even suggest a majority of them, but enough of the ones who were vocal on social media were creating a bit of a ruckus. And I don't think that would have been the end of Darian Durant quarterbacking in Saskatchewan had the Rough Riders not won in 2013, because I mean, he threw 31 touchdown passes that year. He still had a very good year.
Yeah.
But I think there were times when he just wondered if it was in the cards for him, because he'd had so much tough luck. And it was really, of many nice stories in 2013, that to me is the one that really stands out, because I just felt so good for him that day, because just he had been, I think he'd been criticized so much, and it was too much sometimes, and not too much for him to endure. I just thought the criticism was excessive, but I've always thought too that maybe 2% of the people were making 99% of the noise, and seeing how Darian evolved and how he handled things that year. I mean, the night before the West, before the Grey Cup, he shows up on stage at Riderville.com and thanks the fans for coming, and then so, I mean, that was just a real meaningful, I think, symbolic thing to do. And then after the Riders won the game, he got changed and walked out onto the Green Mile and just mingled with the fans, just wanted to revel in it. And, I was just so happy for him that night, because I just knew what he had gone through. I think he hugged Geroy Simon at the, what was it called? I think it was Kahari Jones at the end of the game, and said something to the effect of, "You have no idea what I've gone through." I wish I had the precise phrasing at my disposal, but that,
I think the mics catch it up.
Yeah. And that was, Darian was so emotional, and I think the danger leading up to that Grey Cup was trying to ensure that the emotions didn't get the better of him, and that you don't almost overdo it. And he just continued to play in that game as he had during the playoffs that year. 8 touchdown passes, no interceptions, and that doesn't even account for the damage he did along the ground against BC in the first game.
I felt when he lifted the Grey Cup in the air, that all of it just melted away for that one moment. And do you feel like, I remember walking down the ramps, the west side at Taylor Field, thinking 2009 doesn't really bother me anymore.
Yeah. No, and
Did it add to the triumph that night?
if you look at it, I don't think you can completely appreciate 2013 unless you've been through 2009. And I'm not saying that 2009 was, I hate to paint it, and I'm not trying to paint it as something that was beneficial, but when you've seen the one end of the spectrum to a degree, I think few pro football franchises or professional sports franchises have ever experienced, and then to win it 4 years later, and to do it on your home turf in the last chance you have to win it on your historic field. Talk about one extreme to the other. And I can even go back to, I was at the 76 Grey Cup in Toronto when Tony Gabriel caught that pass. I was at the 89 Grey Cup in Toronto when Dave Ridgway kicked that field goal. And my first notion when Dave Ridgway kicked the field goal was that suddenly the ghost of Tony Gabriel had kind of left the premises. And I carried that with me for 13 years. I was 12 years old and I cried sitting in the stands at Exhibition Stadium that day. And, it was just devastating to see that happen. And that's 13 years later that I just felt, okay, finally I can stop, replaying the Tony Gabriel catch in my mind. And, but you look at a difference of 4 years with players who were, from 76 to 89, the only player who was on both those teams was Roger Aldag. You look at 2009 to 2013, there were some pretty foundational players on that 2009 team who remained in 2013. And the backstory to that 2013 game is, you have to rewind 4 years to, I think, fully appreciate what that meant to those players.
I think
and to this franchise, its fan base.
I think we got to talk about Grey Cup week. I was a younger Grey Cupper at that time. So
I've never heard the term Grey Cupper before.
Well, I've been to every one since 2009, so I think I'll probably call myself a Grey Cupper now.
That is Grey Cupping at its finest.
In 2013, just how cold it was. I remember the owner of the hotel thinking we were crazy, tossing around the football in the parking lot when it was minus 30. And now I probably look back and say, yeah, that was pretty dumb. But I will never forget, froze at the Grey Cup parade the day before the game, and then sticking my head out of the hotel door the day of the game, not keeping up with silly things like weather forecasts, thinking, what magic just descended upon Regina? To this day, I wasn't sure how my plan was probably to stand in the West Concourse under the stands and just stay warm somehow. I really thought I was going to freeze. But the weather that day, the change in 24 hours was
amazing.
Out of this world.
Yeah, that was one of those days you wake up and you just brace yourself for it. It's like, hey, this isn't so bad. And I think it was the first sign that it was going to be a good day. And Tom Hanks showed up that day. No, but I don't think on the Friday or the Thursday of that week anybody was expecting something other than minus 20, and nobody was expecting Tom Hanks. And just everything just came together so perfectly that day, except that I forgot my power cord. I left my power cord at the office, so I had to have somebody drive over to Mosaic, the old historic Mosaic Stadium, through all the traffic and throw a power cord over the fence so I could actually electrify my computer. Yeah. So the stupid things that happen.
Well, and then, you talk about things, the way they went. I remember Henry Burris not being set for or the center snapping the ball far too early, and Hank looking absolutely dumbfounded what had happened, and Darian Durant fumbling the ball into Corey Sheets' arms, and
Yeah.
taking it was at the 38-yard run he had. It seemed like nothing was going to go wrong for the green and white that day, even though there were some nervous moments when the Ticats pulled to within 2 scores in the second half.
Yeah, I mean, things that had traditionally gone against the Rough Riders in Grey Cups didn't that day. I mean, the Rough Riders had won their previous three Grey Cups by a combined 22 points, and then they won one game by a total of 22 points.
Wow.
And the margin was actually greater before Hamilton. CJ Gable got a touchdown late in the game, but the Weston Dressler touchdown gave the Rough Riders a larger margin than that. And it just, throughout the Riders' history, it's been one of bad breaks in championship games, and just bad luck that you just cannot explain. But that day, it just was. I think people knew when the Corey Sheets fumble happened. Everything was just so fortuitous that day, and I just. But I remember thinking, there's a danger in thinking that just because you beat Calgary in the West Final, and people were talking about that as sort of the de facto Grey Cup. And I couldn't subscribe to that at the time, because I remember in 76, the Riders beat Edmonton in the West Final 23-13 after losing to Edmonton the previous 3 years in Edmonton in the West Final. So I remember thinking at the time, my 12-year-old self, okay, we've just won the Grey Cup. We got past Edmonton, playing Ottawa in the Grey Cup, and the Riders had gone into Ottawa and I think beat them 29-16 that summer. So I didn't really think Ottawa presented much of an obstacle. And, well, we know how that one ended up. So I kept thinking of that the morning of November 24th, 2013. It's like, don't take this one for granted. Don't presume that just because this formidable Calgary team has been upended, that it's going to be a cakewalk in the Grey Cup, because 1976. And so when the game was 31-6, I thought, okay, I've got a nice opportunity to get a head start on my column here. And I spent the entire halftime show writing my column, thanks to my wonderful power cord. And then kept on writing into the third quarter. I think this is a bonus. It's one of those kind of keeper editions of the Leader Post. And I know that, this is one of those, you're documenting history here. So I thought, hey, this is great. I got a head start on this too. I don't have to bang this out in a half hour after the game. And so then 31-6 turns into 31-16, and it's like I'm jinxed them. And I got my computer and I didn't dare open it. I kind of gently opened it after the Corey Sheets 21-yard run. And I remembered the 2009 Grey Cup when Darian scored a touchdown from 16 yards out with 10:42 left in the game, and the convert put the Riders up 27-11. And I popped open the computer and started writing a Riders win Grey Cup column. And
Wow.
so I was haunted by that in 2013, thinking, if I done it again here. So I shut the computer and just refused to even go near it for a while. It turns out I was able to use pretty much everything I'd written at halftime, but there were some real nervous moments. As impartial as you try to be at that time, you want to, you grow up following this team, and you never imagine there's going to be a Grey Cup game in Regina at all. And then you're covering your third of what are now 4 Grey Cups in Regina, and the Riders are in it. That's just something you never bank on seeing. And that was a nervous few minutes around supper time that day, or around 7 o'clock that night.
This is bringing back a lot of memories and feelings for me. In 2009, when Riders beat the Stamps in the West Final, I thought that was our Grey Cup. I thought we had no chance of beating the Alouettes. So I remember going to McMahon Stadium thinking, we'll just have fun. We're gonna lose. But I didn't think we would lose like that. So the roller coaster was just, I I'm still dumbfounded to this day of what happened. But we'll talk about 2013 because I remember November 25th, 2013, thinking, I need to have a Regina leader post, and I still have it in my storage room. And I wish I brought it for the podcast. But Domination in Rider Nation, when did that come about? Like, when did that headline happen?
I'm trying to remember. I remember I sent it in. A reader actually had suggested during the 2007 Grey Cup, a reader had sent me an email a day or two before the game saying, if the Riders win, why don't you go with Saskatchewan? So I sent that one into the office and it went, but I guess I'll claim some some credit for Domination and Rider Nation. I think it just rhymed. I'm somebody at the office could very well have concocted it at the same time. I just remember sending in that as a suggested headline, but it's neat to be in that situation where you're documenting that. I remember growing up and I would read the leader posts from 66, and I would see what Laurie Artis, who was then the Leader Post sports editor, wrote. And I always thought, just for the longest time, it was only Laurie Artis who'd covered a Rough Rider Grey Cup victory. And I just thought that would have been so cool to do. And then, 1989, Daryl Davis and Nick Miliokas add their names to the list. And I went to that game just strictly as a fan. I was at Dash Tours the next morning, first thing after the West Final, first person in line to buy a Grey Cup package. And I will always be indebted to Greg Drennan, our sports editor at the time, for letting me sneak away to Toronto when it was kind of a crazy week in the sports department. And that's a story in itself. And then 2007, I was just so conscious of, I got the privilege of being able to cover a Rough Rider Grey Cup victory because it's such a small fraternity,
right?
Of people who have done that, and then to have an opportunity to do it again with the Grey Cup here. Ian Hamilton was covering the Grey Cup that day. Murray McCormick was our Rough Rider beat writer. Daryl Davis in 2007. Daryl Davis and myself and Courtney Wagner were there in 2007 for the Leader Post. So it's I'm really proud to say that I've seen the Riders win a Grey Cup and have documented it, because I know what that 1966 paper meant to me when I was a 14-year-old kid going to the Regina Public Library and always requesting the November 1966 microfilm, which I'm sure I wore out.
I remember my brother saying, you got to get me a paper. I'm running around Regina. It seemed like every gas station was sold out. And on the way back to Saskatoon, I stopped in Lumsden, and I'm like, I gotta try to find a Leader Post, and they had a stack of them in there. So I bought about 5 of them and handed them out to my family that I still have today. And I do want Darian to sign it one day. That's my goal here.
If you'd been at the game on Saturday,
I know
he was signing for everybody. What a wonderful gesture that was by him.
Now, I do want to ask you about that. I do want to ask you one more about that 2013 Rough Rider team. There were several members of that team. Now, Corey Chamberlain did coach again, but that was his greatest season. That was Brendan Tammon's greatest season. G. Roy Simon goes out a winner. It seemed like they had him as a secret weapon. Like you said, he was, not the biggest weapon during the season, but in the Grey Cup, what an impact he had. There were several players where that was obviously the pinnacle of their career, winning the championship. But like Corey Sheets, the last game that counted in his career was that Grey
28
Cup.
years old, and that's,
wow.
That's the fragility of professional football. And it's and that was a veteran-laden team too, and it was one that was able to stay healthy by and large. Chris Best had been injured for the first half of the year, and pretty much he came back. I think he came back for the final regular season game and then into the playoffs, but he'd missed 9 games. Ray Williams, who was having a great season at middle linebacker, got hurt in the game in Winnipeg in early September, and he was forced to miss the rest of the year. But by and large, that team was able to remain healthy, which is not always assured when you're, well, especially in the game of football in general, but when you got a lot of players who were in their late 20s, early 30s, and they really had led kind of a charmed life that year in terms of the injury list. It was never that expansive, and that's one of the things. There's always the element of luck, and we talked about the Corey Sheets fumble recovery and how that easily could have gone the other way. It just sometimes you can do all the planning and plot and scheme, but one look at 2014. The Roughriders are 8-2, and Darian gets hurt, and we can conceivably we could have been talking about a repeat Rough Rider Grey Cup championship team if Darian hadn't been hurt that year. I mean, we've got to remember too, it seemed like the only missing piece that year was Weston Dressler. He had been with the Kansas City Chiefs and had been released in August, and he re-signed with the Riders, and it was Weston's second game back. And I think it was going to take a few weeks for Darian and Weston to get their chemistry going, but that was going to start cooking. And when that did, what could have stopped the Roughriders? They were 8-2 without really having a formidable passing game. And suddenly you get Weston back. And their running game, even though there wasn't a Corey Sheets type presence on that team, it was kind of running back by committee that year. But in terms of rushing yards per game, it was actually pretty comparable to the 2013 Roughriders. Some timely runs by Anthony Allen, and Will Ford had 3 touchdown runs one day, etc. They were able to run the ball without having that bulwark running back, and that 2014 team could have repeated. And again, it's one of those great unknowns.
11.5 million Canadians tuned in to the 101st Grey Cup. Tom Hanks, Martin Short. I mean, Kent Austin is a part of 3 Rough Rider Grey Cup wins. The opposing coach, the head coach, the starting quarterback in 1889. I want to wrap and ask you about
Brett Lothar was on the Hamilton sideline.
Oh wow, yeah.
Yeah, he'd been drafted by the Tiger Cats that year and had played a little bit, but he watched the game from the sideline. Luca Conji was the Tiger Cats kicker that year. Simone Lawrence played in that game. He's still playing for Hamilton.
So I guess there was some Rider connections in Hamilton as well with Fantouz
Andy
and
Fantouz
Burris.
played for the Tiger Cats that day. Henry Burris.
Wow. I want to ask you about last week. Other than the game between the Ticats and the Riders, there was the memorial service for George Reed, and there was the Legends Night with the 2013 team being honored and going into the Plaza of Honor. Was it special to see a lot of those guys back in Regina that weekend?
It was really, really cool. I always enjoyed I enjoyed covering that team. I don't think you win a Grey Cup without just a good group in general, and that group always struck me as being just that. It was great to spend some time with Darian Durant and chat with him, and just to chat with a lot of the players leading up to it too. And it just felt comfortable. It felt nice. Darian hasn't changed a bit. He looks like he could still go out there and play.
He does.
It was so well done. And there was the challenge, after we lost George leading up to that week is, how do you obviously everything changes because George has to be honored. And you want to make sure that every possible tribute is paid to George in the best possible way. And that was a amazingly well done memorial. But still, you don't want the 2013 team to be overlooked, nor do you want Wendy Kelly, the first female inductee into the Plaza of Honor, to be overlooked. And so, the people I work with are just remarkable, and just how they established that balance and the kind of planning they did and the thought and the care that went into it. I'm just so proud to work with everybody from Craig Reynolds. I could just name the whole staff. I'm in awe of what all my friends and colleagues did. I saw what they were doing every day, and it was unlike anything I've ever seen in terms of a vocational team rallying around something. And it was because we wanted to make sure that 2013 team and George Reed and Wendy Kelly all received their due. And based upon the feedback we've received or that I've seen, I think that was accomplished.
I'll ask you one more. What did George mean to even the current generation of players, or even the last few years of players? I saw Darian get asked about the loss of George. It's remarkable how his impact was felt throughout the organization up until, well, now, even now.
Yeah,
it
well,
is felt.
If you walk into the stadium, you can't, a new player is going to find out immediately who George Reed is because of the statues.
Yes, yeah.
Toward, honoring George and Ronnie. There's George's picture is all over. And, you mentioned Gordie Howe earlier. And I always thought that was a pretty, really good parallel, in that you'd see little kids or even young adults or even middle-aged people, and they were still too young to see Gordie Howe play, but they knew who he was, and in his presence, you felt like there was royalty in the room. And George had the same effect on people. It didn't matter if you were 5 or 95. I think you looked at George with that reverence and that appreciation. And you just knew what he'd done, and the way he conducted himself, just with the utmost courtesy and dignity. And it just, that's what really, I think he just transcended generations. I know a lot of people who are Montreal Canadiens fans. They never saw Rocket Richard play, but they know what Rocket Richard means. And, even I think you could apply that to Jean Beliveau. That's the type of, we were looking at, in the days after George passed, the family left a bunch of the, they were going through all their scrapbooks or whatever, and just to make sure that they were taken care of, they were dropped off at the Roughriders offices, and I locked them away. And so one day for several days, actually every chance I got for several days, I was flipping through the scrapbooks, and on one page of a scrapbook or a photo album, there were telegrams from Jean Beliveau and John Diefenbaker on the same page.
Wow.
Like, amazing. That tells you something about George. Would never name drop. George would never consider himself to be above anybody. But how many people do you know that would get telegrams from John Diefenbaker
No kidding.
and Jean Beliveau?
Wow.
That just said it all.
They say nothing good, and to pull back the curtain, nothing good happens after 2 a.m. But here we are, chatting at
my favorite time of day.
I think this is when the best work happens. So, thank you so much for.
This has been so much fun.
Yeah, this has been great. Your work. I feel like you're living your dream job. You covered the Roughriders, the team you followed as a kid, and now, well, you're with the Roughriders, the team historian and senior journalist. So thanks so much for sharing your memories and really putting into perspective and putting a bow 10 years later on 2013 and talking about the great George Reed. So thank you, Rob. Oh,
thanks so much, Travis. It's great to chat with you, and maybe we'll do this again when the rest of the world is conscious as well.
That's a good idea. Thank you.
This is such a. I've done a lot of podcasts and a lot of interviews over the years, and unless I'm talking to somebody on the other side of the world, and it's like, okay, I think it's like 10 a.m. in England now. Maybe I can call them. I've been in that situation, but I can't think of many people I've talked to in North America at this hour, and so it's. My dad was a musician, and he was a creature of the night, and he liked to stay up late, and he was an architect. He liked to work on his drawings late at night, and he liked to listen to jazz late at night, and I liked to talk to the dog late at night. So we got kind of the same habits, and so I'm glad there's a kindred spirit out there.
Well, thank you so much.
What a pleasure. Thanks so much for chatting with me, and hope to do it again.
Thanks for listening. Find more great shows like this at CF Pod Network on Twitter.